Well, let me start this presentation by giving some information about a project background, and that would include talking a little bit about the research team, the motivation behind the key research aims of this project. So to start off with, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow team members who were involved in conducting the research behind today's presentation. We actually had a multidisciplinary team from across 3 universities. As you can see on the screen, there's Dr. Ranjot Singh and Jack Houghton from Curtin University, as well as Professor Emma Baker from the University of Adelaide and Professor Rebecca Bentley from the University of Melbourne. And as a team, we had collective expertise in housing, of course, but also health outcomes and modeling techniques as well. So what are the key research questions of this project? We went into the project with 4 key research questions. We were really interested in looking at how the relationship between housing precariousness and well-being has changed over time. And because housing precariousness and well-being are such broad concepts and such broad domains, we were wanting to drill down into the specific dimensions of housing precariousness. For instance, there are just different forms of housing precariousness, like forced move. For instance, being forced to move is a form of housing precariousness, but so is housing unaffordability. And different dimensions of housing precariousness can affect different well-being outcomes. For instance, well-being outcomes too, you'd have mental health outcomes, it'd be the physical related well-being outcomes. So many different dimensions to look at. The third research question specifically has to do with rental housing assistance policy. We know that many renters are in situations where they're less securely housed than homeowners, but to what extent does rental assistance actually buffer their well-being outcomes against precariousness? And therefore, what can we say at the end about the sort of policy interventions that might be needed and when they might be timed to effectively minimize any negative impacts of precarious housing on well-being? I'd like to talk a little bit about well-being as a measure of policy success, because compared to traditional economic measures such as the GDP, the well-being measure has been a relatively recent measure that's been adopted. So we know that traditionally speaking, when we try to evaluate policy outcomes, a very typical measure has been, well, what's the economic gain from the policy? So a typical measure has been the GDP, or the gross domestic product. Unfortunately, the problem with the GDP is that it is actually quite a limited measure, even though it is one that has been well used over time. The GDP does not take into account non-economic factors, but well-being measures do. Well-being measures ask about how people feel about their state of well-being, their health, their mental outcomes, for instance, their satisfaction outcomes, instance, as a result of a policy intervention, or as a result of a particular situation that they're in. In the case of this particular project, we were really interested in looking at people who were in housing precariousness and wanting to know, well, what's that doing to their own subjective evaluations of their well-being? So you can see that internationally, well-being has increasingly become adopted as a measure of policy success. The OECD's well-being of the OECD now has a well-being framework that covers about 11 dimensions of well-being, that includes housing and health in there. The EU has now increasingly recognize that well-being is a valid measure of policy success, and New Zealand, of course, has introduced a well-being budget that measures policy success not just on economic growth. Yes, economic growth is important, but the well-being budget in New Zealand now wants to measure policy success based on its impact on people, communities, and natural resources as well. So the fact is that well-being is increasingly recognized as a valid measure of policy success because it places the person at the center of any evaluation of policy outcomes, rather than simply what's the state of the economy. So the research method, we drew on a national panel data set, which many of you may be familiar with. It's called the Household Income and Labor Dynamics in Australia survey, or the HILDA survey, which has been tracking people since the early 2000s. So it's almost 20 years old, and it has a sample that is nationally representative. The wonderful thing about the survey, uh, especially in relation to this project, is that it's got a huge range of housing and well-being indicators that allows us to be able to observe different dimensions of precarious housing. As you can see on the screen, we were able to distinguish between precarious housing dimensions that were household-based versus area-based. So the household-based dimensions are the ones that are experienced by the household, and it has a lot to do with their dwelling, such as whether they were able to pay the mortgage or rent payment on time, whether they were experiencing housing unaffordability as a result of based on the 30/40 rule, um, whether or not they were suffering from overcrowding or forced moves. Area-based dimensions, for instance, area-based dimensions would relate to dimensions such as neighborhood crime, neighborhood hostility, and area-based socioeconomic status, of which the most common one is the ABS CIFA index or the ABS socioeconomic index for areas, and that's recorded in the Hilda survey as well. It tells us about whether or not a household is experiencing precarious housing as a result of the neighborhood that the household is living in. And there are many well-being dimensions in the Hilda survey, but we've zoomed in on the two broad strands of well-being outcomes that are very commonly referred to these days in subjective well-being studies. One has to do with satisfaction. We looked at satisfaction with one's life, employment opportunities, finances, feeling part of one's community. We also looked at one's mental health and physical functioning. Now, this is a highly data intensive project. So we use a really large 20-year-old survey that tracked people over 20 years. And the main method that we applied was econometric modeling. This presentation is actually going to be full of graphs and charts and numbers and statistics, which I'm hoping will be really interesting as well, and which I'm hoping will prompt a lot of discussion. So what we did was we ran econometric models where we're basically trying to get at this question of, if you were to take two people and they're exactly the same, except that one is in precarious housing but the other one is not, what would be the difference in the well-being outcomes of these two people? So econometric modeling allows us to answer a question like that, where we try to isolate, differences across social demographic groups so that we can simply zoom in on, well, what is the specific impact of precarious housing on well-being. Now, of course, it has to be said as well that different social demographic groups would be exposed to different levels of precariousness, and I do talk about that as well in the presentation. Uh, we also employ what we call principal component analysis, which is basically a dimension reduction technique. So what I mean by that is that there are so many dimensions of precarious housing, but we were able to combine them into a single index using the PCA, or principal component analysis method. And it's a way of saying, if we were to combine all these dimensions together into a single measure, what could we say about overall precarious housing? It's similar to something like consumer price index, which also takes prices across different types of goods and services and combine them using a technique into a single index. So I hope I'm communicating the intuition there clearly, that it's a way of taking many different dimensions and putting them into one measure, which is usually an index. And in this case, we created a precarious housing index, and we also created a well-being index as well for analysis. So what forms of precarious housing affect well-being? I'm starting to go into reporting the key findings here. Let me start by looking at the trends in precarious housing over time. And as I said, we covered a period of almost 20 years. If you look at the leftmost panel, you'll see that the precarious housing index has actually declined slightly over time. Okay, now it's not a huge decline. It's the axis shows, the vertical axis shows that the decline has been from around 1.15 to about 1.05 over a period of 20 years, which is a very gradual decline. If you look into the middle panel, you'll see the household-based precarious housing indicators like forced moves being represented by the blue line, red line representing overcrowding, and unaffordable housing represented by the gray line. And you can see that it's the gray line that's sitting high above the other two factors. So perhaps unsurprisingly, unaffordable housing is something that stands out. as being a more dominant form of precarious housing than some of the other factors that are at play. And the gray line, it does fluctuate a little bit crazily, but it is trending upwards over time. Okay, then if you look to the right hand side and you look at the neighborhood ones, the one that's most obviously declined over time is the gray line, and that's actually representing neighborhood crime. In fact, if you try to kind of take your eyes away from all the fluctuations and just think about trends over time, what I think I can say is that, in summary, that decline in the precarious housing index over time has been largely driven by a downward trend in neighborhood crime. Okay, unaffordable housing seems to have risen over time, and the other measures have kind of, remained the same. So we can talk a little bit about what this actually means about policy success. Given all that we've talked about housing policies and all that, are we actually doing enough? Because a lot of these indicators have actually not really changed over time if you just look at their trends. So quickly on to well-being. Again, these trends, they do fluctuate a little bit, but if you just focus on the pattern, the well-being index, which is on the left-hand panel, has actually remained more or less the same. Okay, so it's been about 4.6 to 4.7. And again, because I've zoomed into the graph, it looks a little bit like it's improved over time, but really roughly constant over time. There's the satisfaction measures in the middle panel. People tend to report quite high satisfaction with their life overall, as represented by the red line, but financial satisfaction tends to be a little bit lower, which is represented by the blue line. And the satisfaction measures have trended a little bit upwards over time. But then if you flick to the right-hand side panel and you look at the SF36 health scores, they've actually reduced a little bit over time. So these you might sort of look at it and go, oh, well, pretty flat. These lines are pretty flat. The fact is that the data shows that when you ask people about their satisfaction and their mental health and all that, these measures are quite sticky. Let me put it that way. A lot of people tend to say, oh, my satisfaction rating on a scale of 0 to 10 would be about 7 or 8. So the thing is that if our modeling actually shows even a small movement in well-being outcome as a result of people being in precarious housing, that actually shows that precarious housing is having a noticeable impact on well-being. Because if people were left alone, they tend to say, they try to adapt. They try to say they're resilient. And therefore, their well-being scores tend to be a bit sticky over time. So let me move into the crux of it, which is our model. This is a little bit of a complicated chart, so I'll break it down for you. What we did was we ran a regression model, and we wanted to look at, again, the question of if you took two people and they were exactly the same, but one experienced a form of precarious housing and the other one didn't, what would be the gap in well-being between the two? So this graph basically shows the percentage change in each well-being outcome that is affected by precarious housing. The graph focuses on forced moves, which is represented by the red bars, unaffordable housing, which is represented by the gray bars, and the blue bars representing overcrowding. And if you go from left to right, you'll see that we're just going from one well-being outcome to the next, because what we did was we actually ran the model across each well-being outcome one at a time, finishing off with the well-being index on the right-hand side. Because the idea there is to say, well, perhaps the impact of precarious housing on well-being actually differs depending on which well-being measure you're looking at. The first thing I would say, when I analyze this chart, is that all the bars are downward sloping. And what that means is that, yes, precarious housing does have a negative impact on well-being. It results in a negative percentage change in people's reported well-being measures. If I look at the set of bars that's in the rightmost corner of the graph, let's just look at the well-being index overall, because that gives a holistic measure of well-being. What we can see is that forced moves have the greatest impact on well-being. In terms of the fact that it reduces the well-being index by 1.6%. Now, I just want to remind people that, as I said before, these measures are quite sticky. So the fact that it has actually, that they actually shift as a result of precarious housing is evidence of impact. So if we look at the well-being index, it's reduced the most by forced moves, followed by unaffordable housing. Okay, and the blue bar is the shortest one. Then if you sort of spread your eyes across the rest of the chart, you'll see Again, that it's the red bars that stand out as being the ones that are longest, and therefore they have the greatest negative impacts on people's well-being outcomes, including mental health, satisfaction with finances. That's a very obvious one. That's the longest red bar, where you see a decline of 3.4%, which is actually quite large, in people's reporting of their satisfaction with finances when they're forced to move. And that's followed by unaffordable housing. Overcrowding has a somewhat much smaller impact on people's well-being outcomes. You only see two blue bars on the screen because where they're not significant in their impact, I don't actually report them on the screen. If I go on to the next chart and look at more precarious housing measures and how they affect well-being, you'll see that there are more impacts there. This chart focuses on the area-based precarious housing indicators. So I suppose I would say that just to highlight the main point is right in the middle of the chart, you see satisfaction with community. Okay, and those bars are the longest with respect to satisfaction with community, and I think that that makes sense in a way. The evidence here actually supports a lot of what we know to be true, anecdotally at least. So in this case, if you're living in areas where there's high neighborhood crime or high neighborhood hostility, you'd expect that it's your satisfaction with your community that is affected the most. But if I were to compare the previous chart with the current one, I would still say that overall the factors that seem to be making the greatest negative impact on people's well-being outcomes would be forced moves and unaffordable housing. It's not to say the rest are not important, but those two stand out as being particularly important. So, okay, we know that precarious housing affects well-being, and we know that in particular this is true for forced moves and also for unaffordable housing. Well, then who are the people who are actually most exposed to precarious housing? That's an important policy question. So the exposure to well-being is reported in this table that I've got here. I've actually taken different characteristics like people's household types, income, housing tenure, and region, and split them into two groups. One, people who are not precariously housed. That's people who report a precarious housing index that is at the lower end, and then people who are actually precariously housed. And I asked the question of what's the share of people in these groups that actually report poor well-being outcomes. So let me just look at the middle panel of the table, which looks at people who are not precariously housed. So even when people are not precariously housed, you can see that there are certain groups that are reporting low well-being outcomes, and they're the ones that are highlighted in red. So 37% of sole parents who are not precariously housed do still report low well-being outcomes, as do about 31% of the low income, about 24% of private renters, and 48.5% of public renters. If you look at those in each of these household types and income and housing tenure groups who are precariously housed, you'll see that those who are precariously housed tend to be much more likely to report low well-being than when they're not precariously housed. So if you just look at sole parents, for instance, if they're not precariously housed, 37% say they have low well-being. But if they are precariously housed, and about 52% say they have low well-being. But the fact is that the trends are actually consistent across the two columns. Yes, they are higher when you're precariously housed, but it's still the same groups in whether you're in or out of precarious housing who are suffering from low well-being the most, and that's the sole parents, the low-income groups, the private renters, and the public renters. This next chart tries to is where we implemented what I call a gap analysis, and it asks a slightly different question from the previous chart, which is, look, if we line up people in each of these groups, couples with children, sole parents, low, high income, etc., and we ask, what's the well-being gap when they fall into precarious housing? What do we get? So let me just explain with an example. If I take the bar to the leftmost side of the chart, which is couples with children, the low well-being gap there is about 17%. And what that says is if I take couples with children and these couples with children fall into precarious housing, then the likelihood of them reporting poor well-being would actually increase by 17%. Okay, so amongst the four gray bars, which are referring to household type, the bar is highest among singles. So what that says is that singles are the ones who are most likely to report an increase in low well-being when they tip into precarious housing. So slightly different from the previous chart, but it still highlights vulnerability that's particularly evident among certain groups. If I move to the set of green bars, they focus on the three income groups, and the bar is the highest amongst the low income, which is to say that when low income people fall into precarious housing, they're much more likely to report an increase in numbers suffering from poor well-being than those who have high incomes. And then the blue bars represent housing tenure, and the one that stands out is private renters. If you get a private renter falling into precarious housing, that private renter is more likely to report an increase in poor well-being outcomes than the other housing tenures. And again, if you go into the red bars, you'll see that those that are more susceptible to reporting poor well-being, if they fall into precarious housing, are more likely to be in major cities than regional areas, although the difference between those two locations are not really that big. So those are some of the characteristics, low income, private renters, sole parents, etc. They're particularly susceptible to poor well-being when they fall into precarious housing. But what about life events? And here in this chart and the next one, I want to quickly talk about what I call life shocks. So we all experience major life events. Some of them are positive and some of them are negative. And I've got a whole list up here. And you can see that, of course, physical violence would be a negative one. A major worsening of finances would be negative. But then you also have some that are, promotion at work, etc., which could be positive. But the thing is that there are some life events that are much more likely to tip people into precarious housing than others. So the ones that are most likely to tip people into precarious housing include if they suffer from physical violence. That's 22% of people who suffer from physical violence are tipped into precarious housing the following year. The second, almost equal importance is jail detention. So if someone was detained in jail and, of course, released the following year, they're most likely to be released into precarious housing. Separation from spouse as well is important. Funnily enough, getting back together with your spouse also helps to tip you into precarious housing. Someone else might have an explanation for that, but that's what the data shows, and that's what I'm putting up there. But look, the obvious ones to me that have policy implications are that we need to pay attention to people who are suffering from physical violence and also people who have recently been released from jail detention. And there's lots of other factors that are at play, of course, but time is short, so I'm going to move on to my next chart. This next one is quite similar to the previous one in the sense that we are looking at how major life events can cause people to be in precarious housing. But whereas the previous chart was about major life events that tip people into precarious housing, this chart is about major life events that cause people to remain in precarious housing. So this is the one that says what prolongs the precarious housing experience, whereas the previous one was what begins the precarious housing experience. But again, you don't really see too much of a difference in the top factors because you can see again it's physical violence and it's jail detention that's way up there. Okay, we've got property crime as well, and if your family member is the one that gets detained in jail, that can prolong your spell in precarious housing as well. But really, physical violence and jail detention are important factors there. Okay, I'm getting towards the end, but before I wrap up with some policy remarks, I want to present a final piece of analysis, which is about housing assistance. So as I said before, we wanted to take a look at whether or not housing assistance helps to protect the well-being of the precariously housed. And in particular, what we did was we looked at our sample of renters who were precariously housed. We didn't take all renters. We looked at just those who are at that end with really high precarious housing index. And so they can be said to be precariously housed. And we looked at whether or not the receipt of housing assistance actually helped to buffer their well-being outcomes. Because even in that group, you get some who are receiving housing assistance and some who are not. So these are some results from the model. I'll try and explain it in an intuitive way. First of all, when we looked at precariously housed renters, we tried to do it in two different ways because we wanted to test our results. First of all, we defined precariously housed renters as those who reported a high precarious housing index and that's reported in the middle of the table. And then we said, oh, let's define precariously housed renters in a different way as those who experience at least one form of precarious housing. We looked at forced moves, unaffordable housing, neighborhood crime, etc. If a renter said, I experience at least one of them, then that renter is in our sample. But the thing is, even though we tried to define precariously housed renters differently, we got quite similar results. Okay, so the two gray rows, receipt of CRA and receipt of public housing, give us the coefficients from our model. And the main thing I really want you to notice from that is the fact that I have no asterisk and I have no stars next to those numbers. So the receipt of CRA gives a negative coefficient, which suggests that there's a negative impact of receiving CRA on the well-being of precariously housed renters, but statistically, that is actually not significant. So the explanation there is that if you receive CRA, it doesn't actually do anything for your well-being outcomes. And unfortunately, we found the same for public housing, but the public housing coefficient is actually positive. The CRA one's negative. But again, no stars next to them, meaning the model is telling us that these housing assistance measures are not actually having any protective effect on the well-being of precariously housed renters. The ones that are showing up as having negative impacts are what I call the unobservable characteristics of the housing assistance recipients. What I mean by that is that there are certain characteristics amongst those who receive housing assistance that distinguishes them from those who do not. So perhaps a violent family history, perhaps mental illnesses, perhaps addiction, perhaps it's just aspects of vulnerabilities that leads to receipt of housing assistance in the first place. And those are the things that seem to be important, things that we observe from real life experiences that we may not necessarily observe from data. But the receipt of the assistance itself does not seem to be making a difference. And that's, I think, something that we need to have a conversation about. So what are some of the policy remarks I would like to make? Well, precarious housing, yes, it has a negative impact on well-being, particularly forced moves and unaffordable housing. And the research has shown that there are particular groups that are more likely to be exposed to precarious housing than others. And these are those on low incomes, private renters, singles, just people with wider financial constraints. They tend to find themselves much more exposed to low well-being when they tip into precarious housing. And of course, we know from our research that some major life events can precipitate transitions into precarious housing or actually prolong spells in precarious housing. And we're talking about major life events like physical violence, jail detention. And when we ran our models incorporating housing assistance measure, we didn't actually find any significant impact there. So clearly there is some scope for reforming housing assistance so that they can actually become a more effective means of buffering the well-being of precariously housed renters. And we can, of course, talk more about that in the Q&A session. So I'll leave it at that, Michael, and over to you and Emma.
Terrific. Thank you, Rachel. That was a fascinating set of data. There's some really interesting findings there, some of which are a little bit puzzling. The getting back together with the spouse one is I'm curious about. Before I turn to Emma for a response, a number of questions have come through already, and I will just turn to one of those, which was just a definitional one, asking you to explain what CRA is.
All right. Look, CRA is the Commonwealth Rent Assistance, and it's a federal income supplement that's usually attached to your pension or allowance, or if you have children, if you're receiving more than the base rate of family tax benefit Part A. So, intuitively speaking, if you're a low income private renter receiving an income support payment, and you pay rent above a certain threshold, you're likely to be eligible for Commonwealth Rent Assistance.
And just to add to that, if you're interested in learning more about CRA, some previous research that Rachel led, published through her, he looked at the effectiveness of the targeting of that particular scheme and how that could be enhanced. But enough delay, on to Emma. So Emma Greenhalgh, the new CEO of National Shelter, delighted to have you part of the webinar today, and really interested in hearing your thoughts, having seen that presentation.
Thanks, Michael. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am on today, the Yugambeh language people here on the Gold Coast, and pay respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. I'd also like to thank Professor Ong Forge for the presentation and acknowledge your colleagues in the preparation of this research as well. When I was preparing for this session and I was reading the research and the slides, there were three key aspects of the research that stood out for me. One was the relationship around wellbeing and forced moves. The second particularly was about the impact of imprisonment on individuals and families on either ending up in precarious housing or remaining in precarious housing. And then the third was, that housing assistance having little statistically significant impact on wellbeing. So those three things for me are what really stood out. And that's not to downplay the impact of unaffordable housing or physical violence, but it was those aspects that caught my immediate attention. And I think the combination of, unaffordable housing and forced moves is a particularly live conversation right now with the current private rental market. And I think in terms of my response, that's where I'd really like to focus is around unforced moves, impacts on lower income households, and, what this might mean. Because we do know that about a third of the population live in private rental housing. We know it's not a residual tenure. It's a normative housing experience for a large number of households. And we do know that a third of those in private rental, have been there continuously for 10 years or more. And that nearly half of long-term private renters are low-income households as well. So we've got a substantial proportion of long-term private renters living in the private sector, and often due to limited choice of their housing. And I think, with this research, I think really stands out about the importance of security of tenure to prevent lower income households from bearing cost of multiple moves, associated instability, and disruptions from relationships and support and education. Because we do know from previous Uhuru research that the private rental market is insecure with high rates of residential mobility by tenants, and many of these moves can be due to constraints such as property sales, lease not being renewed, a lack of safety, rental arrears, and family breakdown, and that these high rates of mobility are destabilising. And housing transition is a critical life event, and moving from one tenancy to another can be problematic with long-term impacts on the well-being of a household, impacting on physical and mental health, sense of control, but also disrupting, for some households, their access to their place-based services. And for vulnerable households and families, what does that mean in terms of those services that are supporting them, probably to be able to maintain a tenancy. And I think with unforced moves as well, and reflecting on that too with lower income households, is that, they are less likely to have the resources to be required, to move. And we know from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data that, nationally ending a tenancy, precipitates a crisis, and that 50% of clients are seeking assistance due to accommodation issues. And really what we have is a policy environment through tenancy legislation broadly that's contributing to housing precariousness, contributing to unforced moves, and also unaffordability. So broadly, with the exception of Victoria and some recent rental reforms in Queensland, that, there's a lack of protection generally for renters. So for a third of the population, in terms of notice to leave without grounds, lease periods that are only for a maximum of 12 months, and also that, rental caps are not not a feature of our tenancy legislation. So, you know, and what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the increases in the cost of private rental for households. So we've got a policy environment that's contributing to precarious housing, and really ultimately contributing to poor well-being. And I think what this raises for us is some really critical questions about the types of communities we want to create and live in, communities where people have connections, they're able to form attachments, you know, where people can remain in their employment, and be connected to communities, schools, and, you know, their place-based services. The other aspect I'd just like to briefly comment on is around the receipt of housing assistance, so CRA, and not having that statistically significant impact on well-being, yeah, which is quite concerning for a payment that is $5 billion per annum from the Commonwealth Government. You know, we do know that CRA, levels of CRA have not kept pace with rising housing costs, are pegged to the consumer price index rather than the rent price index. You know, and we do know that single person households can be less likely to receive CRA than family households. So I support the recommendations that have been made about increasing assistance, better targeting of assistance. As many of you might have seen, you know, National Shelter and other peaks and campaigns have been calling for an increase in CRA by, you know, 50% to make it, you know, have a greater impact on housing affordability. And I think combined with this too is around the need to increase, you know, income support for lower income households, you know, to have better choice and control around their housing. Yeah, and the last sort of point that I'd like to go back to is about the better need for better support for households who may fall into precarious housing and remain in precarious housing. So this includes both direct housing support and specialist support. So the research has highlighted the need around domestic and family violence prevention measures, supporting, I think, people to be able to remain in their home if it's safe to do so, or adequately and appropriately supported to move. And the other aspect around emphasising the need for better processes and planning for people who are leaving prison, or even before they even enter prison, in terms of their housing outcomes once they leave, and supports that are provided to their families. I do know that former Queensland colleagues of mine would be very highly encouraging the care coordination mechanisms in this instance for people who are leaving prison. So I think for me, what this research demonstrates is the central importance of the delivery of safe, secure and affordable housing in appropriate locations, but also to reinforces the critical role it provides to the well-being of individuals and communities.
Perfect. Thank you, Emma. We've got quite a few questions come through already. Thank you for those. We're going to try and weave our way through them, but do please keep putting questions and comments in, and we'll address as many as we can over the next 45 minutes. Rachel, we might just start with, I guess, a couple of questions digging into the research a little bit and what the study was perhaps able to look at. Starting off with, well, did the study look at different age demographics? Did you look at sort of an age effect within this? I guess some of the variables like retirement apply more to some age groups than others.
Yeah, well, we did look at people's movements in and out of precarious housing and whether or not that actually differed by age groups. And we did actually find quite a bit of a difference there. You know, because of time limitations, I didn't actually present on that. So thank you for the question, whoever put it up. So what we found was that young people were more likely to fall into precarious housing than older ones. And young people were also more likely to remain in precarious housing than older people. So just to quote some stats, if we looked at people aged 25 to 34 years old, about 1 in 5 fell into precarious housing in our data set, okay, across adjacent years. And amongst those who are already in precarious housing, if you look at them in precarious housing in 1 year and you looked at their housing status the following year, you'll find that 1 in 4 would still be in precarious housing the following year. The percentages are much smaller for those who are, say, in the 65 plus age group. And in fact, the trend seems to just it's quite the trend was quite linear across age group, in the sense that as you grew older, your likelihood of falling into precarious housing and remaining in precarious housing actually fell. But I would also, but I would want to make some comments there, because I don't want to give the impression that older people are therefore all, stably housed and have no need of support, because I think we're all well aware of the fact that there are growing groups of older people who are becoming homeless. Particularly concerning group would be single older women. The data does not actually, I just need to clarify that the data does not actually capture people who are homeless. So that's a separate, conversation that we need to have, because there are older people who are increasingly finding themselves unstably housed, who are actually not captured by the data.
That's right. In fact, one of the other questions or comments really picks up on that, and in particular focusing on older women. And Emma has really, I guess, put a question to you about what are the solutions that stand out to you for older women who are becoming or at risk of homelessness.
Which in my previous work had quite a bit of involvement with the Queensland Housing Older Women Network, which undertook some great advocacy with the Minister and the Department of Housing in Queensland to get a very specific response for older women that had a number of, I guess, pillars in that sort of program. And I think, first of all, we can never go past, the increasing of income support for lower income households. It is completely unrealistic to expect people to be housed appropriately with the current levels of income support. So that would be the first one that I would have there. The other thing too, I think, for older women that we see is around what are the types of support, because often for older women, they won't recognise that they're homeless. So they might say, well, I'm living with my son or my daughter, or I'm doing this, or are technically experiencing homelessness, but may not consider that they are, and, reach out for support. So, shouting out to the Home at Last model that HARG have in Victoria, which is also a feature of what's been announced recently in Queensland. So very specific, models of support for older people. Also too, around different housing types. So through innovative housing responses that allow people to share housing if that is something that they want to do. And that could include things like shared equity home purchase for some older women. But I think it really is that multitude of responses, because for that cohort, like any cohort, they're incredibly diverse. So it does really need, quite a range of responses.
Rachel, a quick clarification one on the study. How many in the survey?
Look, we actually compiled almost 18 years of data. So we had about, we ran many different models, but on average was about 150,000 cases in the data set.
Fair size sample.
Yes.
And I guess coming back to sort of being precariously housed or housing precarity, I mean, to what extent can you equate housing precarity with risk of homelessness?
So as I said before, homeless people are actually not tracked by the HILDA survey. So I think with the precarious housing measures, we were trying to get basically to a measure that gave us some kind of an indication of people who are at risk of tipping out into homelessness. So I think that some of the precarious housing dimensions would be much stronger indicators of the risk of homelessness than others. So forced move indicator would be one. Um, but there would be a few others where you look at the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood, for instance, that may not be such a strong indicator of homelessness. So I would say, yes, to a degree, the precarious housing dimensions do give us people who are at risk of homelessness. But in particular, I would say the forced move indicator would be the appropriate one.
Yeah. One of the comments that came through quite early actually was quite a topical one, obviously at the moment, around the association with impacts of floods and fires and I guess other natural disasters on tipping people into precariousness of housing, but also I guess the well-being impacts. Is that something that this study was able to pick up on at all?
No, unfortunately. It's a limitation of the data set, but it is an important question, especially with what's happened with the flooding and all that. And it's just that it's not something that we covered in our analysis and not in the data.
Yeah, I guess some of those life event scales, that's starting to become something to think about for them.
Yes, that's right. And I wouldn't be surprised if these flooding, exposure to flooding, natural disasters, etc., become are going to start appearing in the Hilda survey. But not in the years that we covered, because I think we went up to 2018.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that, Michael? Just thinking in relation to some areas too that where there might be flooding, where the housing is generally seen to be more affordable, being in some of those lower lying areas, so that people who might be living in precarious housing that are going to be more susceptible to climate induced or related disasters, because that's where cheaper housing is. And I think things too like often where caravan parks are located, particularly in Queensland, on floodplains next to rivers. But I think also in terms of what possibly might have happened in Lismore, that's where the affordable housing was as well.
I think that's right. I guess let's just sort of step back from the particulars of the recent floods, and to what extent were you able to do regional breakdowns in the study and look at the particular, are there different patterns in remote areas of the Northern Territory, for example, where there's particular issues around overcrowding and so on, versus in the larger metropolitan areas, and to what extent are those sort of varying patterns?
Yeah, well, I guess the thing about, coming out and presenting data from a national survey is, you do start getting interest in, well, did you do an age breakdown, a location breakdown? Were you able to look at Indigenous populations? And those are all really pertinent questions. And we were able to do some of that, but not others, partly because, of the time constraint and partly because of the data limitation. So with Indigenous households, for instance, we didn't have enough cases in the model for me to feel confident to present data that's specifically on Indigenous people. But we do know certain things that we can glean from the presentation and the report itself. There are certain characteristics, certain experiences that Indigenous people are more exposed to. And so and those seem to be some of the indicators that are much more correlated with precarious housing as well. So certainly when we start talking about targeting and where we should be directing a concerted and effective assistance, I think Indigenous households would be certainly one population group that we would want to look at, as well as some of the other households like sole parents, for instance, and private renters, very, very clear that if they were to tip into precarious housing, that really suffer from a drop in well-being. I'm sure that the circumstances of the Northern Territory will be quite important and quite particular. But again, we looked at a national picture overall. We didn't actually I think one of the things, and perhaps other Ahuri research might have done this, I will be honest and say that I was not very satisfied with the overcrowding measure that we used. But because we were looking at a range of indicators, we did what we could with the overcrowding measure. We wanted to look at it. You can see that I didn't talk much much about it in the presentation, but I'm hopeful that other Hurry research would have done a little bit more, perhaps even qualitative work into measures of overcrowding, because that's actually quite a limitation in the research that we've done.
I'm happy to report that we have current work addressing that exact question at the moment that is working its way towards publication, and does include colleagues from yours over at Curtin. So you can follow up with them offline if you like. But look, I think it's a continuing question. And I guess related to that, talking about the territory and so on, there are a couple of questions asking about First Nations households, and did you see different patterns emerging there at all, or was the data sort of able to pick up on that?
Yeah, so again, because we had small numbers there, but as I mentioned before, there's certain indicators that are, I suppose you'll see, for instance, issues around exposure to financial vulnerabilities and all that. That would be a little bit more evident, I think, amongst First Nations households. So what we didn't present directly on First Nations household, those characteristics give us some insights into some of the issues that face and their greater exposure to precarious housing and adverse well-being outcomes as compared to a typical Australian, middle class, but Australian household.
So we have a theory submitted on that interesting question around the impact of getting back together with a partner. And it's come from a researcher, not one who was an author on the report, I'll admit, but suggesting that it might be to do with people moving back into a more crowded household because of the breakups and reforming partnerships, possibly with other parts of family or parents involved. Was overcrowding particularly picked out there? Did you look at that?
Overcrowding, as in like when people.
Yeah. So if you've got back together with a partner who's living with other people and becomes an overcrowded house, this is just testing a theory here.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I think this was not about people getting together, but it was about people getting back together.
Yeah.
It may be the case that a separation, because this is obviously you have to look at people's histories as well. It may be the case that the separation itself caused a lot of financial distress that people were not able to overcome immediately in the year that they got back together. And that could be one issue. It could be that would, I think, be an issue for people who perhaps have precarious employment, are on lower incomes. But then you really, I'm sure that there'll be another group for which this is a transitional issue. It's something that disappears after 1 year. It's you get back together and your housing just hasn't adjusted yet to your new circumstance, but you could perhaps be well in a position to actually adjust.
And I guess there's a cause effect thing. To what extent is it correlation or is it actually causal? It's I mean, admittedly, it's not the biggest policy issue that's brought out by the data, but it is an interesting little point all the same.
I thought we'd get a few laughs anyway from that.
It's created some interest, absolutely. I guess one of the things that we didn't talk about in the presentation, and I'm not sure to what extent it's addressed by the survey tools used, but does gendered violence come through in this at all, or the nature of that impact, rather than just physical violence more broadly?
Yeah, so we can of course break the data down by gender if we wanted to, and what we would find is that the victims of physical violence would much more likely to be a woman than a man, and that's very clear in the data set. So while I presented a chart on being a victim of physical violence, really most of the people represented in that group would be women, and so that's certainly a factor that's at play, and of course that's also quite a factor that's at play in resulting in women's homelessness as well. So I think there are policy implications there. One of the things that I think we could have more of a discussion about is around when you look at domestic violence that a woman suffers and the woman's homelessness, I think in some instances, sometimes we treat it as a domestic violence issue, and but there's actually an important housing component there as well that could come into play. And housing policy could certainly be, I think, more supported and more visible in being and looking at domestic violence is potentially an issue that is very much related to housing as well. I think there's much that we could do to harness housing policy to deal with the issue of domestic violence and help people cope and go through that experience and come out at the other end. But sometimes perhaps the conversation around how we might use housing to help people through that gets a little bit lost in the whole conversation, because there's an intersection between the two issues, of course, and sometimes we find it difficult to talk about it at the intersectionality, and we look at it as either one issue or the other. So I think that's the important point of discussion to be had there.
I think that's right. I mean, there are real practice implications there. Emma, perhaps is that a topic that you'd like to add comment to around the relationship between?
I'm just going to say that Rachel has frozen for me, so I've missed a good part of her response.
Okay, that's a shame. Well, I guess, look, we're talking about the relationship between or the role of gendered violence or domestic violence in housing precarity and the relationships between those factors, the intersections between those sorts of challenges. And I think from your work in recent years, that's something that you've been quite aware of. And I guess getting a bit of a practice perspective on that from you.
Yeah, and I think what the responses are that are very much about keeping women and children in their home if that is something that they choose to do, and where they feel safe to do that, and also where responses are not just about the support services. Previous work in my previous role, with Q Shelter, there was it was around what's the role for private real estate agents to be supporting, in relation to domestic and family violence. So not that everything needs not that there needs to be a service delivery response from real estate agents, but ways in which they can be aware of domestic and family violence, responding, and also being aware very much of the current legislation, which has changed with COVID, and then more recently, say in Queensland, to be much more supportive for people to be able to stay home and put in security measures, or to leave if that's what they need to do so without being penalised.
All right. I'm not sure whether Rachel's still frozen for you or not, but no, good. Look, I'll go back to Rachel with I guess I'm going to try and summarise a fairly long comment that's talking about the sort of findings you've seen here and the relationship between precarity and the impact of life events, and to what extent does living in housing that is not precarious act as a protective or sort of a cushioning factor for people who experience life events, so that their impact might be less severe than people whose housing is more precarious? Is that something the study was able to interpret?
Look, I suppose from a modelling perspective, you could flip all the precarious housing measures.
It's a different way to look at it, isn't it?
Yes, but I think you'd still. I hesitate to say that you'd get exactly the same results, but I think you'd get the same patterns in the sense that if you found what we found was that forced moves were very much an important precarious housing dimension that negatively impacted well-being. So if we were to, for instance, look at people who had long-term housing stability, I'm quite confident that the model would throw up results that tell us that they have better, stronger well-being outcomes than otherwise. So it's really if we wanted to just arrive at some broad conclusions, then I think flipping the model around is obviously affordable housing is an important stable housing dimension, that would actually seek to that we could see would be protective of people's well-being outcomes. So I think that's what we would find. We also did find that private renters are very much likely to report a dip in their well-being outcomes if they were to fall into precarious housing. So naturally, if you were to if we were able to provide more stable housing for people in the private rental sector, you'll see smaller numbers and smaller shares of them being so exposed to poor well-being outcomes. And that's something that we could do a whole lot better in, I think. Um, and it's not the case that there's no evidence out there. As I'm sure you know, Michael, I think Hurry, and others, have presented a bank of research calling out for the fact that CRA could be improved upon. But of course, also that CRA on its own doesn't actually address housing security issue. Um, because it doesn't actually deal with the issues of without grounds termination, for instance. And it goes back to Emma's point about tenancy legislation, I think, as something that we need to look at as well, because that can help us to do a lot on the security front.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the increased welfare payments we saw during the initial pandemic with the job seeker and job keeper payments that really made a dramatic difference to many households, particularly on the sort of low to moderate income levels. Really speaks to that, doesn't it? The
Yes,
direct financial impact, and obviously across the country a whole range of protections for renters around eviction moratoria and rent increase moratoria were implemented, and the extent to which they actually achieved what they'd set out to do is possibly a bit variable, but the intent was clearly there, and the combination of those two mechanisms is, I guess, well, it's the subject of another piece of Hurry research that's about to be published, so I shouldn't preempt that too much.
Yeah.
Emma, you talked a little bit about around the increase of CRA, and I guess to what extent has shelter been, whether it's Q Shelter or National Shelter, I mean, your current or previous role, been focused on security for renters as a key issue?
Yeah, absolutely. National Shelter has been focused in its policy platform around security for renters. So, particularly those on lower incomes. Adrian had undertaken a piece of work that's not finalised, examining sort of options around CRA. Because it just sort of makes me think back to, the conversation around CRA has been happening for a very, very long time, around its effectiveness and targeting. And, I'm just thinking, Marion Wolf's kind of work, which is, quite a while ago. But I think, with CRA, it's such a significant outlay by government, and I would hate to think that it's not there, but how do we make it work a lot better for those who need it? Particularly in this current environment, what is its real impact at the moment? And yeah, a third of our population is renting and will continue to rent. We can't have a discussion around housing in Australia without, without recognising the role that renting plays and will continue to play. And how do we support those households that are, precariously housed in private rental?
Rachel, glad to see you back. You just disappeared for me for a moment.
I apologise. I realised I must have shocked you and must have got you worried there for a minute. But yes,
well, Emma was going to get a whole lot of technical questions about the study otherwise. Look, there are a couple more detailed questions that I might just fire off. Well, actually, there's a couple of related issues here that I might tie together. One is talking, I guess, about culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and to what extent was precarious housing different in those communities to, I guess, the non-linguistically diverse Australian households. And also, there's a related question here around visa status, and was that a factor? And more to the point, was this study actually gathering data on those things to be able to address those questions?
Look, no. Sorry to disappoint, but no, we didn't actually look at that. I think these are all to really get into the specific type. We did a national study, and I think we came up with some high-level evidence. But to get into, I think, the specific precarious housing experiences of people from CALD backgrounds, people perhaps who are on temporary visas, that, and perhaps having issues with precarious employment even, and wage issues as well. I think we'd have to either run a specific survey on them to be able to get robust results, or actually do some qualitative work and talk to them about the specific issues that they face.
And I mean, I recognise that. I guess I'm asking or conveying those questions, not so much thinking that Hilda's going to have that data, but more, I guess, demonstrating the interest that the presentation has generated and the additional questions that people are putting forward. So there's clearly a rich vein of interest and further topics to consider, I guess, with other methodologies down the track.
Yes, that's right. And I think what's been highlighted here is that there are some groups that are going much, I think, while I've not presented the data for that, they're much likely to be exposed to precarious housing. So, people from CALD backgrounds, First Nations people, that's where people have been asking specific questions about. And also in specific regions as well. One of the things that perhaps needs to be done is to take a better look at a lower spatial scale. And also, in Western Australia, where I'm, for instance, the metropolitan region is very, very different from the regional area and the remote area as well. So I think there are perhaps issues, infrastructure access issues are perhaps much more severe, perhaps in remote areas, and those are the sorts of things that where it would be actually beneficial to start talking about different regions separately, remote areas separately from metropolitan areas, etc.
Emma, has your work looked at CALD communities in particular, or for that matter, at people with different visa status?
Look, I can't speak from a national shelter perspective, but just allow me to go back for a moment. It has only been 4 weeks, but there was some very specific interest about the support and housing options for households on bridging visas, particularly in different visa types, and what is available to them. If they don't have income and a whole range of in some parts of the sector, it is a serious discussion, particularly in terms of how they provide support to people that might have no income, in housing, and there are no barriers to accessing homelessness services, but people's ability to maybe pay as time goes on, and what is the financial cost to services. That has been quite a live discussion.
Emma, I've got a question that I'm going to put to you in the first instance, and then Rachel, perhaps we'll see whether the data can shed any further light. So it's phrased as a question to you, Emma. Do you think that policies taking working singles or young people are taking working singles and young people into enough consideration? So suggesting that many policies and financial support programs are targeting families or domestic violence survivors, but for single young people who are not students, there's not so much help available other than trying to encourage employment. Is that reflective of your experience?
It's also been, I think, particularly around young people who might be on a supplement, has been quite a point of discussion when community housing providers have been trying to house, because housing providers in terms of rent payments, possibly not even enough to cover, the outgoings, and that if, younger households or, single person households, and that income support not being enough to sort of really meet those costs. So there are real discussions, and around what support is provided to young people and single young people, and how the service system is able to support or house them.
Yeah, well, let me just make some comment about single young people as well, because the research, not in this particular project, but related, a Hurry research that we've done on, myself and others have done on CRA, we actually find that more could be done to reform CRA to better meet the housing needs of single people. Many of them, are younger people. Of course, there are older singles as well. The thing is that I think the way that CRA is structured does mean at the moment that families with children, you know, much more likely to get CRA when they're in housing need than single people. And that's a clear issue, a problem with targeting. Of course, after you get into targeting, once people become eligible, then there's the issue of adequacy, which is that the CRA payment's not enough because it hasn't kept up with rental costs over time. So there's actually a double issue that's at play here. And the eligibility issue, the targeting issue of CRA is actually adversely affecting young people. And of course, we know there are growing numbers of older renters, but really, young people are overrepresented in the rental sector. And so I think that's quite an important policy instrument we really need to look at, which is common welfare and assistance, and how we can reform them. And I'm sure that the positive impacts will flow through to young singles as well. There are, of course, other non-housing measures because a lot of young people are facing precarious labor market circumstances, being on casual contracts and things like that are at play as well. And these all interact with precarious housing because if you are in precarious employment or unemployment, then you're more likely to fall into precarious housing. But it's the other way around as well. If you're in precarious housing, you're more likely to find your job is destabilized. For some people, the very fact that you don't have a stable address you could put into a resume is a problem. I mean, it sounds like a small thing, but it isn't. It's quite a major problem for people who are precariously housed. So then it becomes a cycle, of being in precarious housing and precarious employment, which lands you in precarious housing again. And we've got to start somewhere. And I would say that Commonwealth rent assistance is one policy area where I think there's broad agreement, at least amongst academics and those of people like Emma, who work in the sector, that is an area that is definitely in need of some improvement. And with that, we can see some positive outcomes happening if we could just try and shift focus a little bit more towards renters than simply, to be honest, first home buyer policies all the time, as was seen in the recent budget. So,
there are a number of, I guess, quite technical, detailed questions that I think actually are better answered by people hitting that handouts link on the right of screen and grabbing the full report and diving into it. Probably not easily conveyed in a verbal presentation. So I'd encourage those who are looking for more detail to grab the report. It's right there. But there is one here that I'll pick up on, which well, first of all, thanks you, Rachel, for the presentation and Emma for the response, and congratulate you on the research, team, Rachel. But asks about the role of carers and whether or not any of the surveys pick up on people who are performing that role as carers for, whether it's for for family or for friends or someone, helping to look after other householders and the well-being strain that carers often experience. And I thought that was one that was worth raising.
Yeah, look, I'll make some comment about that. I've done some work on both formal and informal carers before, and obviously there are issues at play there, and a lot of it is has to do with, I suppose, the relative inflexibility of people's employment contracts that sometimes place carers in a very difficult position of having to perhaps give up job opportunities in order to provide caring to either an elderly parent or perhaps even a spouse who is unwell. And sometimes, in the case of some people, they sort of have multiple caring roles, both for children and as for elderly parents as well. So I think there's a role for a labor market policy there, and a lot of women are overrepresented amongst informal carers. And so, again, if we talking about productivity in this nation, and raising productivity, we could really look at doing something about more flexible work arrangements for carers to still be able to participate in the workforce while performing their caring duties. In relation to precarious housing, I suppose if you look at the circumstances where people actually have, sometimes informal carers actually have to give up good job opportunities in order to perform their caring roles, then we would potentially see that people who are in those sort of roles are stuck in a situation where they may not be able to access the best housing that they could otherwise if they were in a stable job situation. So carers are definitely, again, another group that I think we need to look at, because they do perform an important function in the economy. But unfortunately, again, with measures like GDP, we don't actually count what they do. We don't count it well, and because of that, it's just not documented, because it's hard to quantify their contribution to the economy. But what they do is actually quite important for the well-being of others, really. And again, that's, of course, a measure of policy success as well. So a lot of carers also, because they're single mothers, that's caring in terms of caring for children and all that. So I think looking at providing more stable housing for people in those situations, especially if they're on low incomes, would be quite helpful. But then that takes us back to this conversation of we need more social housing. And I think that's a point that maybe has not been made, and I know it's been made over and over and over again in plenty of forums. But perhaps I think it's worth saying it again in a forum like this when we talk about precarious housing. That in an important policy solution, yes, it'll cost something, but an important policy solution is to expand the stock of social and affordable housing that beyond what we currently have in this nation.
Clearly, one of the solutions to precarity is social housing. That's absolutely right. Emma, did you want to pick up on the carers topic at all? Are you having audio problems?
I think one of the things that I'd probably just sorry.
Seem to be having a bit of a delay there, but that's all. Go ahead.
Yep, you can hear me.
We can.
Sorry, I've got freezing at my.
All right. Look, we'll perhaps come back to you in a moment, Emma, and see if it's working then. Another topic. Well, actually, before I do, I guess someone's just popped in a question saying they're having trouble seeing the handouts area to the right of screen. So they've put that question in the Q&A area. Right next to where it says Q&A, there should be the word handouts and a red dot next to it. If that's not visible to you at the moment, the other way you can get hold of the report, it's actually quite simple to get at the moment. If you go to the AHURI website at ahuri.edu.au and just scroll down a little bit, and it's one of the most recent reports still sitting there right on the homepage. So shouldn't take long to find. Emma, is the video catching up with you again? Not really.
Is it catching up with you?
Yeah, no, well, we're hearing you. There's clearly a delay. There's some sort of lag there going on. It's a bit troublesome. Look, I'm going to put a question to Rachel that you can then have as on notice, so that it gives you a little bit of time to catch up as the clearly slow connection through to you is playing out, which is not really about the study per se, but actually, I guess, a wider question around precarious housing and what you would see, Rachel, as the role of local government.
Look, that's a policy question, obviously. I'm sure all tiers of government would have a role, but I think I would I would take the opportunity to emphasize, and this is not to say that I don't think, that local governments have any role to play, but I would take the opportunity to emphasize that I think the most obvious impacts that we can make, the most obvious positive difference to precarious housing that we can make, is to look at the current forms of assistance that most renters receive, and that would be CRA, Commonwealth Rent Assistance, and public housing. So if we were talking about, look, what's the role of government? Yes, local governments may have a role, but really, I would say I would push really for the point to be made that it is reform of Commonwealth Rent Assistance that we need first of all, before I think local government comes into play, and as expansion of the social housing stock. I'd also say that one of the points, that we haven't actually talked about is the fact that when in the findings from the project showed that CRA was not making a positive difference, but the impact of public housing was not significant as well.
Mm.
So we need to look into that. It's not just the fact that we have inadequate public housing, but perhaps what Emma mentioned about access to place-based services in her response to my presentation is something that comes into play as well. So are we building new social housing in the right locations that actually allow people easy access to services is, I think, something that needs to look at if we ever got to that place where we were willing to expand social housing.
Fingers crossed. Emma, I think you've got your camera off to try and improve the audio. Is that working? I'm going to take that as a no, that the connection's not quite up to scratch.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, after a lag. But did you want to make a comment about the role of local government?
No.
No, it's not working properly. All right, look, we might admit that the telecommunications infrastructure is not quite holding up for the webinar at this point. I did notice a comment back from the person asking about the handout that they'd found it. I wanted to also point out that the email that we send after the webinar, the survey and so on, will include a link to the report. So there's lots of ways you can get hold of what is a very rich set of data and analysis and some really interesting findings. So look, I think given the technology challenges that we've had, we might call time, and we're pretty much at time anyway, actually. And say that, look, we have effectively reached the end of the webinar for the day. I really want to thank Rachel and Emma for speaking today. It's been a really fascinating discussion, lots of great questions, quite a few really technical ones we probably couldn't quite get into in this format, but again, the report is there and is well worth the read. Look, we look forward to bringing you more webinars during 2022. We've got lots of plans for the series and for other events and offerings throughout 2022. So you want to make sure that you're getting information about those in time. Make sure that you're subscribed to the Ahui News. It's easily done from the homepage of the Ahui website. Jump on and make sure you subscribe so that you know about the events as they come. They do sell out. This webinar was fully subscribed. They have a cap of 500 people that they can cope with, and we were well and truly there. So, do make sure you're paying attention to that news and to the opportunities to engage with the research throughout the year. And look, just a quick reminder that we'd really appreciate your feedback by completing the survey that's being sent out to you, I think, as I speak. And if you'd like to share this webinar or the recording of it with your colleagues, it'll be on our website very soon. So look, until we see you again, and good to see you back on screen, Emma, look, thank you for joining us today.